You may recall last time we talked about the three primary and then the secondary precepts of natural law. And we talked, the primary one being self-preservation and preservation of society. And out of that primary precept, one of the secondary precepts was, more or less from the Ten Commandments: do not kill, do not murder. And this leads to the question, well, what would Aquinas say about warfare? Okay. Well, he has a lot to say, so we can answer that question. Now, you would think that perhaps he would take the pacifism position, okay? Because when we look at Christ's teachings, one of the things we do see is this idea of forgiveness, turning the other cheek, not responding with violence when violence is done to you. But he doesn't do that, okay? He does recognize that those teachings make it a very serious decision whether you're going to use violence or not. But he doesn't acknowledge that they preclude the use of violence, okay? Now, why would that be, do you think? I mean, it's just, what do you think? Based on what you already know about Aquinas' teachings about self-preservation, for instance. Remember why he has that as his primary precept? Okay, he says that people have this built into them. Of course, Aquinas believes that God is the ultimate author of everything. And so he looks at the animal kingdom as well as human beings, and he says we share this with the animal. Every animal in the world seeks to preserve itself and its species, almost always, okay? And so this cannot be wrong because we can see God's laws with our own eyes here. We can observe them every day, both in ourselves and others. So our observation of this basic fact means that the biblical, quotations having to do with turning the other cheek must not be taken to mean that one has an absolute obligation to basically not resist violence, okay? Because that runs counter to the instinct that's obviously in us, and if it's in us, then it's there because God put it there, okay? So that necessitates a different understanding of what's going on in the Bible than just an injunction to be pacifistic, okay? So he says, this precept, this first primary precept of self-preservation and preservation of society it just comes from our observation of our basic instincts, okay? And furthermore, he says that if a person does turn the other cheek in the sense of not resisting violence, okay, not fighting back, that may be a noble choice for the individual under certain circumstances, okay? Because he asks the question, what is this teaching for? Okay, what is turn the other cheek? What is that all about? Okay, and by the way, what do you think that's all about? I mean, what could the purpose of that turn the other cheek teaching be?
To distinguish ourselves from the beasts?
Okay, yeah, right. I mean, in other words, to say something about the nature of Christ to other people and to make our us sort of an example, right? And so he concludes that it is noble when a person rises to the level of basically saying, no, I will not resist because of my faith, as an example of the faith that person has in Christ, which can then, impact other people around them. But when you're a ruler and you're responsible for a lot of other people, then to make that choice doesn't serve that purpose of creating the noble example. So a lot of people are harmed, and then do they think, gee, what a good Christian prince, to put us in harm's way like this? Probably not. So he does delve into, what is the true purpose of this rule, and based upon his understanding of the purpose of it, he concludes that for a ruler to turn the other cheek is irresponsible and doesn't serve the purpose. because people will not see it as a sign of God's love that they have been, allowed to be put in harm's way like this and not defended. Does that make sense? Okay, so, in other words, to be really kind of blunt about it, if the ruler didn't do anything to defend you and the enemy comes sweeping over your land and kills some of your people, and then he says to you, sorry, I couldn't do anything about it because the Bible says turn the other cheek, you might not like your religion very much at that point. You might be questioning, whether it's really good for you. And so it doesn't serve its purpose there. It doesn't seem like love coming from the ruler to not defend you. So he just doesn't think that's what it could possibly mean. All right, so elsewhere he also argues that he says Jesus accepted soldiering as a legitimate occupation, and therefore it's another reason why Aquinas rejects the proposition that it's always sinful to wage war. Okay? And I brought in this story because he does cite this story from Luke, it's also in Matthew, about the Roman centurion as an example of that he gives of Jesus basically not objecting to the occupation of soldiering. This is from Luke 7, starting with paragraph 6. Then Jesus went with them, and when he was now not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying unto him, Lord, trouble not thyself, for I am not worthy that thou should enter under my roof. Wherefore neither thought I myself worthy to come unto thee, but say in a word, and my servant shall be healed. For I also, and this is still in the words of the centurion, I also am a man set under authority, having under me soldiers, and I say unto one, Go, and he goeth, and to another, Come, and he cometh, and to my servant, Do this, and he doth it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, turned him about, and said unto the people that followed him, I say unto you, I have not found so great a faith, no, not in Israel. And they that were sent, returning to the house, found that the servant whole that had been sick. Okay? So he says nothing about the soldier's occupation there. He deals with him like he would any other person of faith. And the soldier has made it clear that he's in charge of others, that he's a military man. Yet Jesus doesn't say anything about his occupation. He doesn't say, Go and don't be a soldier anymore. Like he says to the woman who's committed adultery, Go and sin no more, right? He doesn't say, Go and stop doing what you're doing and I'll heal your servant. He just treats him like anybody else. So Aquinas uses this as a support for his view that Jesus does not object necessarily to the military role. Okay? So that leaves him room to reason about then what is appropriate, what is the appropriate use of the military role. So he thinks that human reason is the final arbiter between right and wrong in such debates when the Bible gives us less than clear guidance. And since the Bible doesn't give specific rules about war, okay, and when it is appropriate or when it is not, and when it's less than clear about exactly when self-defense or other uses of force are acceptable, then that leaves room for God-given reason to work and apply the principles that we do know from the Bible as well as from nature to this issue, this particular issue. So he goes back to, again, observe the way human beings are created. God put within us independent reason, so he expects us to use it, and in this case to apply it to a very, very difficult situation of war. And so this is where we get Aquinas' much more developed just war theory. We saw a little glimpse of it with Augustine. He does deal with war, but not systematically, whereas Aquinas really does deal with it fairly systematically, and so he gives us the foundation for later just war theory to develop even more completely. So I want to go through some of the use ad bellum ideas of Thomas Aquinas from the Summa. Jus ad bellum refers to justice, the justice of the war. In other words, judging whether the war itself is just, not dealing with the strategy or the tactics of the war, right? Or individual decisions and so forth, but just the question of, is this a just war? Okay. So the first thing he says is necessary to judge a war to be just is proper authority. Okay. So he says, first, the authority of the sovereign, by whose command the war is to be waged, and just as it is lawful for them to have recourse to the material sword in defending that commonwealth against internal disturbances, so too it is their business to have recourse to the sword in defending the commonwealth against external enemies. Okay. Now, proper authority for Aquinas simply means that the person who is legitimately in charge of the country or people make the decision. Not that it has to be a particular kind of government, okay? But it has to be a legitimate government, which means a government that is recognized by the people as is basically good for them, okay? An illegitimate government would be a tyrannical government. He deals with that separately, okay? So it could be a king or prince. It could be an oligarchy, okay, or an aristocracy of some sort. It could be a polity. Any of those can be proper authorities. And so in contrast would be maybe a rebel leader who's not in charge or shouldn't be considered in charge of an entire country making a decision to go to war. Some private person deciding to start a war, like a noble who decides to attack another, starting a war. Those would be improper authorities. Okay? Now, does that mean then that rebellion is never justified, because rebellion can be started by somebody who isn't supposedly proper, who doesn't have proper authority? Well, like I said, he makes a distinction between legitimate and illegitimate rulers, and so he actually goes in a different direction from Augustine. Remember, Augustine said, if you have a bad ruler, what are you supposed to do? If you have a tyrant, right, accept him. Accept him because he is a scourge of God. If you have a tyrannical ruler, it's because, God determines everything. So you must have that tyrannical ruler for a reason, probably because you've sinned or you need to be chastised somehow. Whereas Aquinas says no, sometimes the sin is on the leader's side, okay? And not every ruler is put there because God wants them there, okay? So free will, of course, is operating here. And, when somebody decides to become a tyrant and take advantage of his position, then the sin is on him, okay? And not necessarily on the people. They don't deserve it necessarily, okay? And so in that case, he does allow for just rebellion, okay? He says a tyrannical government is not just, because it is directed not to the common good, but to the private good of the ruler, as the philosopher states. So that's Aristotle. Consequently, there is no sedition in disturbing a government of this kind, unless the tyrant's rule be disturbed so inordinately that his subjects suffer greater harm from the consequent disturbance than from the tyrant's government. Okay? What does that last part mean, do you think? What's the caveat? This part here about the tyrant's rule being disturbed inordinately, that his subjects suffer greater harm from the disturbance than from the tyrant's government. What do they have to think about?
Just like maybe what's going to happen afterwards, and just like who's going to take over. That it's like you have to consider, at least they have to consider it's going to be worse if they take him down and they keep him in the power.
Yeah. You have to consider the possibility that the outcome, or even the conflict itself, might be worse than the problem you've got. For instance, if the ruler has an incredible amount of power behind him, in the whole military, he's obviously able to fight back very effectively against your small rebellion, and you don't have the ability to really win probably, then basically what you're going to do is you're going to start a conflict that you can't finish and your people are going to be crushed, right? Or in another case, maybe you can win, but you don't have anything to replace that ruler's power with that's any better. So, you have to know, or not know, nobody can know, but be fairly certain that you can win. If you don't think you can, there's no point in starting it. There's no such thing as a noble, the noble fight here. Because again, you've got the responsibility of a lot of other people writing on this. So with that in mind, if there's a good chance of success and the ruler's tyrannical, it's justified to try to overthrow him. All right, so he does make a strong distinction between legitimate and illegitimate rule, and he does sanction rebellion, and that's a major difference between Augustine and Aquinas. And also one of the ideas that has legs, that moves into later on secular just war theory and also secular political thought with the idea of, the right to revolution. All right, so the second rule of jus ad bellum is that the cause must be just. Okay? Secondly, he says a just cause is required, namely that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it on account of some fault. Now, this is one of those passages where if you stopped right there, it would seem a bit too broad, right? Some fault, not good enough. But he does elaborate. You wouldn't go to war just because you didn't like somebody else's culture or whatever, their religion. It wouldn't be good enough. But the fault turns out to be some sort of harm done to your country. Okay? So he says there must be a proportionally good reason for going to war. Okay? It can't be just, you don't like these people, they're insulting you, or they don't respect your country or something like that. And it can't even be something such as, one of your tourists goes off to this country and gets mugged or something like that. You can any problem that you can deal with on a diplomatic level is not a good enough reason to go to war. Now, but if the country next to you invades yours and tries to take a part of your land, then you're justified. Or you're even justified if you see them arming up and getting ready to do that. Okay? And he wants the response to be proportional to the offense. And people ask, does he mean it has to be exactly the same or exactly the same level? No, it doesn't have to be exactly the same. Okay? But it can't be out of all proportion to the offense. For instance, if the neighboring country takes a small part of your land, you're justified in pushing back and perhaps taking a similar amount of theirs, at least for a time, to show that you can, or taking something from them in addition to pushing them back, but not taking over their entire country. And when you do that kind of disproportionate action, I think he thinks that causes more trouble. And the whole point is supposed to be to achieve peace and balance. Okay. So, and that leads to the third and final major jus ad bellum rule, which is right intention. Now, this is something that kind of went by the wayside in secular just war theory, okay, and secular natural law development, because it has to do with what's in the heart, and this is something that's peculiar to his Christian perspective. Okay? But what he wants to know is, when waging this war, when making this decision to wage war, are you doing it to achieve peace? Are you doing it in order to achieve that balance that can maintain peace in the future? Or are you doing it for some other reason that's more sinful, such as, vengeance, just adventurism? The fever of revolt refers to just the, people who just would rather be in control themselves and don't have a really good reason to revolt. Lust for power, okay, upon which a lot of the old wars were based. A king might just decide, I just want to, go take some land, from some other country. Want to have something to do, and that's not a good enough reason. In fact, it's the opposite of a good reason. as a Christian thinker, he thinks the only reason should be peace. And so, but this is something that, later on people said, well, how can you even know the intention? And what does it mean to be peaceful in warring? To have a peaceful attitude in warring. He says, we do not seek peace in order to be at war, but we go to war that we may seek peace. Be peaceful, therefore, in warring, so that you may vanquish those whom you war against and bring them to the prosperity of peace. So when you think about it, I guess the aftermath of World War II with the Marshall Plan might be a fairly good example of that. In action. In other words, we saw the intention. We could see the intention through the action to bring these countries back into a peaceful state and prosperous state so that they would no longer be a threat to us.
So would Aquinas agree, disagree, like if a country was next to another country that they knew they were not friends with, and this one country was stronger than the other, but the other country was building up arms, or they felt that eventually this one country was going to attack them, and they did preemptive strike against them to make sure that they stayed weak, would that be considered justified?
No, he does discuss that, and that's a great question. To just sort of suspect, and this may be a flaw in his theory, because as weaponry got more and more advanced, to allow another country to arm up like that truly is very threatening, and the intentions can seem pretty clear, but what he says is that's not a good enough reason, that you need to try to deal with that in a more peaceful way, in a diplomatic way. It might include arming up yourself so as to also be able to defend yourself if they do invade, but without some sort of direct action. For instance, if they're not only building up their weaponry, but they're massing it on your border, then yes, then you're justified. If they're simply spending more money on weaponry than they did before, then no. And so preemptive war is not allowed by Aquinas anyway. So yeah. Later on that was changed, and I think part of the reason for that change amongst a lot of theorists was that the lethality of weapons and the delivery speed became a completely different thing than it used to be. And so to wait until you could see absolute, direct evidence that you were about ready to be attacked was to wait till it was too late. Whether it's with conventional weapons as well as nuclear weapons. We're living in a different world as far as what it takes to observe these things and how fast they can be deployed. So okay, so there are a few other criteria that he does not develop as completely as those three, but they became important to other theorists. So we'll look at those. He says war must be a last resort. This kind of goes along with some of the things we've already said, but he develops it as a separate principle. He says that we need to do everything we can short of war, and diplomatically we need to first offer our enemy a peaceful settlement. In other words, we need to give them a warning. Okay? And again, this became a little bit less practical in modern warfare, right? But what he's saying is, in order to give the enemy a chance to back down and avoid war, you need to put them on notice and tell them, this is what we see you doing, this is what you've done, and this is what we're going to do in response, okay? If you do not back down. So that's how you show that war is a last resort, if you've tried everything that you can to avoid it, okay? And again, this is it's influenced by his Christian beliefs and his propensity. This is his interpreting of that term, the other cheek. You do what you can. You're not required to have yourself be destroyed, but you do what you can in order to try to avoid it. He also develops the idea of proportionality a bit. Okay, and so, again, building on what we've already said, he points out that a defensive war can at first be justified, but if you go further than you need to for that proportional response, it could become a war of aggression, and that's unjust. Okay? So you should use enough force to right the wrong, okay? And maybe even deter future wrong, okay? But not so much that you begin your own war of aggression or conquest. Okay? And again, the reason for that is because if you go further than that, it becomes about vengeance. It becomes about power, and this perpetuates the cycle. Okay? This is what your enemy has done. You are now doing the same. This creates, more distrust, more hostility instead of less. So you want to defuse the situation if possible. That's why proportionality is important. Okay. He also develops the idea of double effect, but not fully. Okay? Double effect is the idea that when you wage war even for a just reason, your actions are going to cause both good and bad effects. Okay? And this has to do with intention. He goes back to intention again, and he says your intention has to be directed towards the good. In other words, for instance, if you go to war, your intention is to protect your people and establish peace. Okay? If your intention is right, but you inadvertently kill your enemy in the act of trying to defend yourself, then your good intentions mean that you have not committed some sin or some unjust thing. However, if your intention it just becomes to kill as many of these people as possible, it is not just. Now, we'll talk a little bit in a moment about collateral damage, which he does not develop fully. In other words, the idea that in a just war, some innocent people will be harmed or killed, that as long as your intention is not to do so and you've taken efforts to avoid that, then accidental killing is not crime. But here's what Aquinas says about double effect. He says, nothing hinders one act from having two effects, only one of which is intended while the other is beside the intention. Now, moral acts take their species according to what is intended, not according to what is beside the intention, since this is accidental. Accordingly, the act of self-defense may have two effects. One is the saving of one's life, the other is the slaying of the aggressor. Therefore, this act, since one's intention is to save one's own life, is not unlawful, seeing that it is natural to everything to keep itself in being as far as possible. And yet, though proceeding from a good intention, an act may be rendered unlawful if it be out of proportion to the end. So the issue that he's dealing with is simply killing your enemy, okay? And, the Bible says, the Ten Commandments say you should not kill. So this goes back to what does that really mean and how do we apply it? And he's saying that in warfare, when you're under attack, if your intention is simply to defend yourself and your people, but you end up killing your enemy, that is not murder, that is not a sinful killing. It's an unintended consequence. Okay? Again, it's about attitude. So basically, and I'm sure more difficult to do than it sounds, you have to not be intending your attacker's death while still at the same time doing whatever it takes to stop them, okay? Which is most likely going to mean they're going to die anyway. So again, future thinkers were critical of this because they said, how can people really control their thoughts, and how can we really know what their thoughts are to be able to judge whether they have the right intention or not? We can judge based upon their actions, but as far as their internal, status, very difficult for us to tell, and very difficult for people under stress to be able to actually have the right intention at all times. And is that really a problem? All right. So later thinkers did develop this, maybe, which is still a principle that's used today, is accepted by our military, is the idea of double effect, meaning that we take what precautions we can to save innocent life. But if in the course of warfare innocent lives are lost, as long as we've taken steps to avoid that and our intention is not to do that, then it is not held against the justice of the war. Okay? So typically non-combatants are defined to mean, men who are not actually soldiers, women unless they are soldiers, children, the elderly, anybody who's not actually more or less in uniform, and anybody who's not actually fighting. And of course this again becomes problematic in some cases of modern warfare because the idea of uniform or identifiable fighting forces is not always there, right? And so you have to, these distinctions without that kind of obvious evidence, and it becomes more difficult. But still, the principle, to the extent that it can be applied, is applied. Okay? That you want to avoid non-combatants. It becomes very difficult when you're fighting against people who fight within civilian areas, okay? Like urban fighting, or people who use innocent people as shields and so forth. So we call this idea the idea of collateral damage, that there's damage that's done that is unrelated to and unintended by the actions that we take. This was developed by Francisco Vitoria, 16th century Spanish philosopher that Arnhart actually mentions. Okay, so maybe some of you have heard of him, Hugo Grotius, okay? 17th century jurist and considered the father of modern international law. Okay? So next I want to talk about some of his ideas and how he secularizes and elaborates on this just war doctrine created by Aquinas. But first, let me just stop and ask you if you have any questions or any instances you want to deal with. The history of just war theory is fascinating because it's developed as, at the same time, military capabilities have developed. So it always has to be applied. Every generation has to work with it some more. But it's been retained very seriously by Western militaries for a long, long time. And so the question is not should we try to apply moral principles to what we do, but how can we do that given the current circumstances that we're dealing with. Okay. So Grotius is the author of De Jure Belli Pacis, which is the law of war and peace. And if you ever get a chance to do a paper on just war, he'd be a good place to start. So he starts out with the principle of just cause. Okay? And for him, it's about survival, it's about self-preservation. And it's easy to secularize that idea. It's basically a secular idea to begin with. It doesn't rely, Aquinas' idea that we're motivated by self-preservation and preservation of species doesn't absolutely rely upon any sort of biblical quotation or any sort of theological understanding. Okay? It can be understood by anybody. So basically Grotius takes this idea and says that just cause must be self-defense or could be, provocation by violating of certain rights and defense of your property. And all of these are related back to survival. So he also says that, he kind of expands a little bit on what you were asking about. He says it can be self-defense for an injury received or one that is imminent. Okay? So while he too would not say, you could go to war against some other country simply because they seem to be hostile, that you don't have any direct evidence, he goes further than Aquinas in elaborating, okay, under what conditions can you go to war when you haven't been actually attacked yet, but you can see that you're about to be attacked, okay? And he does think that's justified, okay? So he says, fear with respect to a neighboring power is not a sufficient cause. For in order that self-defense may be lawful, it must be necessary, and it is not necessary unless we are certain, not only regarding the power of our neighbor, but also regarding his intention. The degree of certainty required is that which is accepted in morals, which of course doesn't totally solve the problem, right? But then when you think about it, if somebody actually spelled out every possible situation that they could think of, there would always be one that they hadn't thought of. So a certain degree of generality is probably useful here. Okay? But it has to be more than just, I don't like these people, they seem to be stronger than us. Okay? But notice that he says it has to be regarding your enemy's intention. So if you have some direct knowledge of his intention, either through intelligence, for instance, where you have very good intelligence that a plan is about to be unleashed, right? Or if you can observe actions which anybody could perceive to be aggressive, that are short of going over your border, then you have a justification. Now this is interesting, and it also has been taken up in modern just war thought. This is about humanitarian intervention. Grotius said that when you see gross injustices going on in another state, where a ruler is completely illegitimate and is abusing his people, there may be instances when that is bad enough that you're justified in intervening, in basically invading in order to stop these injustices, which he kind of characterized as crimes against humanity. So that's an exception to the general rule that you have to be either directly attacked or you have to about to be attacked, right? And here you may not ever be attacked because basically this ruler is attacking his own people and abusing them. And he's a secular theorist, so this isn't about Christian doctrine, okay? But it's about preserving the peace generally, okay? If you allow somebody, a dictator, to run over his own people, especially if it's in your neighborhood, you're allowing disorder generally, which may eventually come back to harm you and your country. So there's a reason there. There's also just a moral obligation that may be there to intervene. So that's the kind of reasoning that has been sometimes used, right, in our own time to justify intervention. It was part of the justification for the Iraqi war, for instance. And some people criticize the United States for not getting involved in intervening in the Rwanda massacre. So, in fact, nobody really could intervene, or did intervene, I should say. All right, so, and then he develops this idea of proportionality further. Okay? He says the good towards which the war aims has to be proportional to the evil that the war will cause. Okay? So he promotes a sort of cost-benefit analysis. In order for a war to be just, you have to do that cost-benefit analysis. And if there's a chance that your striking back or your intervention, in the case of intervention, would lead to worse problems or more destruction than the benefit it will cause, then you shouldn't undertake it. So he says, this is how he applies it. The king who undertakes a war for trivial reasons or to exact unnecessary penalties is responsible to his subjects for making good the losses which arise therefrom, for he perpetrates a crime, if not against the foe, yet against his own people, by involving them in so serious an evil on such grounds. So I like that because he's, as a modern theorist, he's drawing the attention of the ruler to his people and his responsibility to be responsible for his people's safety and their interest. Okay? So he's saying, think about what your actions will do to your own people, and is it a good enough reason? He also includes reasonable chance of success. There has to be a reasonable chance of success, even if your purpose is just. And he gives more information on how you give notice. Okay? You have to publicly declare war. Again, this becomes much more problematic in modern times. Okay? But this gives the enemy a chance to redress your grievances, offer something that will avoid the war. During the Cold War, this was an issue, with ethical theorists. Was, we're in a constant state or a constant posture of war in a way during the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the United States armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons and mutual assured destruction being the policy, right? So the idea was that if a missile comes our way, we launch our missiles, and this was a deterrent for both sides to never do that. But there could be no, what would the point be of declaration under those circumstances? Okay? The declaration, in a way, is the mutual assured destruction policy. Okay? But as far as the actual decision to take action, declaration would mean nothing under those circumstances. So it would not be useful. Okay. So you might say that's a little bit old-fashioned concept there, but the underlying intention is, if there's any way to avoid, you should, and therefore to give the enemy a reasonable notion of what's about to happen to them. We can do that sometimes, Of course, another problem is when we make empty threats and don't do anything, right? When we say we are, that's not good either. He also echoes Aquinas on legitimate authority and on war being a last resort. So we've already covered all of that. What he omits has to do with his time and with his intention to apply the law of war, not just to Christian nations, but to all nations. Okay? And so he omits any sort of just rules just related to intention, what's in your heart. Okay? He says that we cannot know the internal state of individuals making these decisions, and that what we need to judge is the actions itself. Okay? And on that basis, we can see whether they're just or not. So he just dispenses with that whole idea of intention. Now, going past Aquinas, or farther than Aquinas, Grotius gives us jus in bello, which is about how the war is fought, and has to do with such things as, the strategy, the tactics that are applied, okay? And oftentimes the responsibility of individuals, whether the commanders or soldiers. So he points out that soldiers cannot be held responsible for the justice of the war because that's beyond them. They didn't make those decisions. Okay? So we can't blame them for the war itself, which is a distinction that we even make in our popular culture these days after Vietnam, right? I mean, it's constantly spoken of that you don't blame military people for policy, right? However, what they can be blamed for is violating the laws of war. Okay? And he actually develops this idea that soldiers need to know the law of war themselves and be prepared to disobey unjust orders, even if they're given by proper authority. Okay? And that's something that our military still is taught. Okay? They're taught to be able to distinguish and to make those judgments. And you hope that they ever have to, but it's kind of interesting that you might say, how can a military operate when people are encouraged to make independent judgments? Well, you know, it's acknowledging that there comes a point where if they can't make independent judgments, they will be involved in war crimes that can, you know, damage the interests of the state, and acknowledges the idea that sometimes commanders can go bad or can make very, very bad decisions. And there has to be some sort of balance, there has to be some way of handling that. Obviously, if the decision to disobey or to object is a very serious one, I think it would only be taken under really obvious circumstances. So given that, then, every military person has to understand some of these things. Okay? So one thing that they should be taught is the idea of protection of the innocents and who the innocents are, who the non-combatants are, in other words. Grotius defines them like this. He said women, of course, because at his time, women never, you know, they were never soldiers. So I put in unless they're employed as soldiers, obviously, because in order to apply it these days, we have to make that change. Children, old men, people engaged in commerce, farmers, and prisoners of war who are to be protected. And he develops ideas about how you deal with prisoners of war. Religious people, and so there's a lot of people, in other words, anybody who's not a direct combatant. And he does develop the idea of double effect or collateral damage further too. He says one must take care as far as possible to prevent the death of innocent persons even by accident, except for reasons that are weighty and will affect the safety of many. No action should be attempted whereby innocent persons may be threatened with destruction. So he does allow the exception. And there are going to be times when it can't be avoided, and if the reason is good enough. One of the decisions of World War II was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it's still debated to this day, you know, whether those fit this criteria or not. You know, with some people arguing that the damage of allowing this war to continue anymore would have been more harmful both for the Japanese and for the Allied forces, and other people arguing that the war was almost over and it was unnecessary. So it's been applied in that case critically. Michael Walzer is a just war theorist who elaborates this idea further in his book Just and Unjust Wars. He says actions must be taken to minimize the foreseeable bad effects, even if it means accepting an increased risk to combatants. He wanted to emphasize the humanitarian element, okay? And he was critical of this doctrine of double effect being used to justify things like bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the firebombing of Dresden, I think he mentions as well. And so he wanted this to be the norm, that, you know, we will accept more damage to combatants, and his reason was because combatants are intentionally in harm's way. Okay. Although I must say, one of the problems I've had with him is in World War II, many people were drafted, so they weren't actually intentionally in harm's way. All right.